Hi designers! In today's lecture video, we're going to be talking all about fonts and typography. We start here with fonts because fonts and type is so crucial to the understanding of graphic design, because most always graphic designers are going to be having to use text along with their images and illustrations in their design work. So you have to have a good understanding of fonts and the study of fonts, which is typography. If you want to geek out for a little bit, you can watch this short, very fun stop animation video of the history of type, and it kind of shows you how type has evolved over the years, similar to the way we talked about graphic design and how it's evolved. Every time there's a new technology, fonts and typefaces evolve along with it. But I'm not going to force you to watch it, but if you want to geek out, it's there for you to watch. In addition to the three lecture videos that you'll be watching at home, you're having 4 tutorials here. Now, the tutorials are a little bit heavier, like the Illustrator tutorials in the beginning of the semester, just because there's so much that I've got to teach you about Illustrator. So just know that there's going to be lots of those as the year or the semester progresses. There are fewer of those, but we will be working through 4 Illustrator lessons in class: Illustrator 2 on objects, the Type Tool Intro 1, the Advanced Type Tool, and then creating a texture background, all of which is going to lead into the project that you're going to do, which is your first really big project, completely in Illustrator, all digital. There is some vocab. We're building on our vocabulary of graphic design, and it's all going to be about fonts. So you're going to learn what typography means, typeface, legibility, and then you're going to learn about these 6 different font families, which are modern, script, slab serif, sans serif, old style, and decorative. And then we're going to talk about the 3 type relationships, which are concordant, conflicting, and contrasting. We're going to start with the first half of our vocab, which is typography. So I want you to stop this video and you're going to watch this short, I believe it's a 5 or 6 minute video on typography. She does a great job of showing you some illustrations and helps you better understand the field of typography. And when you're done with that video, come on back here. All right, so now you are an expert in typography. Let's make sure that you've got all of these terms and concepts under your belt so that you know. So if you didn't grasp it from the video, typeface is another word or we use for font. Now, for being really picky in the world of graphic design, there is a slight difference between a typeface and a font, but generally speaking, they essentially mean the same thing. Okay, even though there's a slight difference. We're just going to say typeface, font is interchangeable. It just means the style and size of letters and characters and how they work within a block of type. There's all different types of typefaces. And as technologies evolve, typefaces evolve, and typefaces go in and out of fashion and in and out of trend. And the video kind of went over that a little bit about how, as technology has evolved, there are certain fonts like Comic Sans that graphic designers know not to use anymore. But they're there, and that video is interesting if you didn't watch it. But we are going to talk about all of those different fonts. Because there are so many available, we have to know which ones we can use with other ones. It's a lot like matching colors. Certain colors go with certain colors, certain fonts go with certain fonts, and ones you should never use together. And that's what this lesson is about today. So make sure you're taking good notes in here. So hopefully you have down your first 2 vocab terms: what is typography and what is typeface. All of this has to do with legibility. Legibility simply means the ability to clearly see and read text. So you can see the example where it shows this first line here where it says this is harder to read than this. A good trick to test the legibility of your text is to squint your eyes. So if you squint your eyes right now and you let your eyes kind of go soft and fuzzy, notice how the bottom line you can see much clearer than that top half. And that's what designers have to be aware of. Graphic design, especially with text, has to be easy to see. It has to be easy to see because it has to be easy to understand. Okay? If you can't see it, you can't understand it. So legibility has to do with how clear you can see the font. So as I said, we're going to be learning about the 6 different font families or categories. Now, is this extensive? No. Are there some that kind of fit into one or more multiples of these? Yes, there's some grayish fonts, but generally speaking, fonts will fit into one of these 6 main categories. The first is sans serif, and this is where I would take copious notes today because the quiz that you're going to have tomorrow is going to test your understanding and your ability to identify these fonts by their families. So the families mean all of the fonts that fit into this category. They are what's called monoweight, which means the weight of the line is going to be the same throughout. So if you look at all of these letters, the thickness of all of these letters is pretty consistent. There's little to no change in the line weight. All right, that's your first clue that it's sans serif. The other is that it has no what are called serifs. Serifs are kind of like the little hats and shoes at the ends of letters. They're just a little flourish on the ends of where letters start and stop. A sans serif font will not have those. So like these little dotted lines here, those aren't serifs. They're not part of the font. They're to just show you where the letters start and stop for where the designer would have been working on creating the type. In other words, sans serif fonts, they're very simple. And in fact, some people can see them as boring, but honestly, they're very clean fonts. And right now they are trendy. Sans serif fonts are very trendy. If you look at graphic design, you're going to see them everywhere. And because they're so simple, they're often used for body copy. Body copy means the fine print detail. So it's not your main headlines. You're not usually going to see a sans serif font as a big dominant headline. You're going to see it as the minor text somewhere lower in the hierarchy, which means the level of importance of the text, right? So your smaller text is going to be sans serif. The next category is probably your most common, and that's slab serif. It's used a lot in advertising. Why? Because it's really easy to make out those letters. One of the issues with a sans serif is because it doesn't have the little serifs, the little hats and shoes. Sometimes the letters can blur together just a little bit. You don't have that issue with the slab serif. So it has little or no thick to thin, again, just like a sans serif. So slab and sans serif are very similar, okay? The main difference, though, is that a slab serif has serifs. Okay, so just to back up a little bit. So sans literally is French for without. That's what that term means, sans serif. So without a serif. A slab serif is, it has serifs. They look like slabs. So they're going to be straight horizontal or straight vertical, typically speaking. So there's vertical serifs. Slab serif is very, very boxy, very box-like. The letters have little to no slant, or what's called a vertical or stress. Notice they have a vertical stress. If you were to draw a line through the text, it's going straight up and down. They're not angled in any way. You can kind of tell. The easiest way, I think, are to look at your L's and the top and the left side of your B's. Notice that line is going completely straight. Another way to look for your stress is if there is a thin to thick transition. So if you look on the A here, this is a little bit thinner than here. If you connect the thinner parts, that will give you your stress. So you can see here that your stress on the slab serif is going straight up and down. Slab serif, really easy to read, very, very basic. An example of that would be the Claridon. Most of your word processing documents, they're going to be in a slab serif. That's your default because they're easy to read. The next up is something called a modern font. It's called modern because most of the fonts actually came out during the mid-century modern kind of aesthetic, so Art Deco. So if you've had English class and you've read about the Great Gatsby, modern fonts would be all over during the mid-century modern kind of time period. But it's similar to slab serif. Okay, so it's going to be very box-like again. It's going to have a very strong vertical stress, so it's going to go straight up and down. It's going to have serifs typically, and they're going to be straight up and down. Okay, but the difference is they have an extreme thin to thick transition in the letter. So if you look here, this part of the B is really thin. This part is really thick, which gives it that strong contrast. So I'm going to flip back again. Notice there's not very much. These are almost monoweight, but not quite. There's a little bit of transition for the thickness, but a modern is extremely thin to thick. And that's the dominant characteristic of a modern font, is that thin to thick transition. Tends to give it an elegant look, a very clean look, very box-like. Again, that's that mid-century modern Art Deco aesthetic that was very popular in home decor and other fields within the art and graphic design world and industrial design at the time. Now we come into old style. Now we're starting to get really confusing because old style is also somewhat like a slab serif. So it's going to have some thick to thin transition. Probably isn't going to be super radical, but you're going to have a thick to thin because that's going to help you identify that the stress in the letters is going at an angle. Now the angle might be angling to the left or it might be angling to the right, but it's not going straight up and down like a modern font would. Okay, that's your big clue. If there is any angle, it's probably an old style font, because if it's going straight up and down, it's either modern or it's going to be a slab serif. Your diagonal stress, that is the dominant characteristic of an old style font. It's still going to have your serifs. Your serifs, some of them are probably going to be at an angle too. So you can see here, this one's at an angle, but these ones are not. So this is where it gets kind of confusing. These are general guidelines. These 6 families are general guidelines. They're not every font is going to fit perfectly into one of these 6. You have to look for the dominant characteristic. So again, in modern, the dominant characteristic is that thick to thin. Your old style is going to be that slant. And the reason that's the dominant characteristic is because they're trying to replicate old school hand lettering by scribes, which would have been done with a calligraphy pen, which would have thick to thin transition and an angle to the way they held that calligraphy pen. All right. Then we have script. Script is usually pretty easy to identify. It is based on cursive or formal handwriting. So it still is going to look like it was done very precise. Okay, so it's formal, but it is cursive. So sometimes your letters are going to connect, sometimes they're not. But I don't want you to confuse them with decorative script-like fonts. So again, a script font still, it looks like handwriting. So it's meant to look like somebody wrote it by hand with a pen, but it is somebody who did it with some knowledge of fonts. In other words, it's very precise. It's gonna look like traditional cursive. You're often going to have serifs, but not always. Again, it's kind of gray of which fits in this, but usually when you see a script font, you can tell a script font. You can say, hey, that looks like it was done, it's cursive style, or it was done by hand. It looks technically skilled. They tend to look more formal. You'll see them a lot on like invitations for weddings or fancy events. Not something that you would use for body copy. This is probably a headline type font. But again, I don't want you to confuse it with this type of font here, which is what's called a decorative font, which is our last of our 6 categories. And decorative font, there's not a lot of specific characteristics I can give you other than it has an obvious personality. So when you look at the text, they're very picturesque. They have a mood. So I'm going to go back to this previous slide, this one here. It's meant to look like it was made with a Sharpie, or very childlike. It looks, quote unquote, messy, right? There's nothing formal about it. Decorative sometimes the letters themselves in a given typeface, this is one typeface, okay? It's not different. It's one typeface. Notice the letters are all drawn completely different, but it's meant to look that way. It's meant to look kind of cartoonish. So they have an obvious personality, or maybe they look very retro, or they look scratchy, or they look like a heavy metal poster. They have an iconic feel or mood to them, and you know it's because they have a limited use. So like a font like this, as a graphic designer, there's only a very few number of graphic design jobs you would be able to use a font like that for, versus any number of these. You would use those. They're common fonts. You would use them on a variety of projects, whether it's a menu design or a business card for a pet supply company or a commercial for a Jaguar car. You know, it doesn't matter. Those fonts themselves are more universal. They can be used on lots of different things, versus decorative fonts, or they're very, very specific. You look at them and you're like, oh, that looks like a horror film font, or that totally looks like a font that should go on a flower business logo. okay? They have a limited feel. And here's the cool thing about decorative fonts. We love decorative fonts. That's we're like, ooh, I love that font. You can usually get them free online. Why? Because most of the people who come up with design these, they're not money makers, because graphic designers, they don't sell really well. A basic font like this, because graphic designers have to buy their fonts if they're not a standard font. You want to buy a font that you're going to get a lot of use out of. If I'm going to pay $300 for a font that I can use in my business, I'm going to want to pick a font that I can use on multiple projects. This font, if I buy it, I'm only going to be able to use it on a handful of projects, if more than one, So usually you can get these fonts either free or really, really cheap. So let's practice now that we have these 6 different fonts. Let's see, looking at your notes that you wrote down, let's see if you can identify fonts based on these 6. Oops, I already went through the first one. So let's go back. So what is this font category? Right, it's sans serif. So there's no serifs. That's your first indication it's probably sans serif. The type is very mono weight, so all of the letters are the same. There's no obvious stress anywhere, so that's sans serif. What about this one? Take a look at your notes. What do you think? Did you say modern? If so, you are correct. But what if you're saying, whoa, 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 I don't see serifs on a lot of these? And I would say you're right, but what is the dominant characteristic? It's that thick to thin transition. So this is a modern font, because that is the defining characteristic of a modern font, is that severe thick to thin transition in the letters, and it's going straight up and down. What about this one here? What do you think? Did you guess script? Because you're right. Looks like cursive. Your letters are pretty much drawn the same way, so it's more of a formal handwritten font. So it is script, it's not decorative. What about this one? Did you guess decorative? Yes, this is not a script font, because if you look at the letters, they're not exactly always drawn the same way. They're drawn in the same kind of style, but notice like the R's have loops, but nothing else has a loop. They're different heights. Sometimes the letters have a different weight. They have a different stress on them. Like the F's kind of stress this way, but then the E's stay straight up and down. The T's actually go that way. So because the letters themselves have changes within them, that means they're more decorative. What about this one? Did you guess old style? Ooh, this is a gray one. I would actually, if you wanted to say, you know what, Mrs. Shore, I actually think this is more slab serif, I would say, you know what, I would say okay. I wouldn't say you're far off. The only reason I would say old style is simply because the serifs are at a tilt. They have a direct angle, but the letters themselves don't really have a stress other than the E's. The line here is kind of at an angle. So this is about 50% old style, 50% slab serif. So I wouldn't count either one of those wrong. What about this one? This one's kind of a tough one, but in my expert opinion, it's decorative, right? It kind of has a movie theater kind of very in your face, very bold. Again, it's not a font you would have a lot of use for. Think about it. Like, what could you use this on? You really couldn't use it on a lot of different graphic design pieces. It's going to have a limited shelf life for what you could put it on. So I always call this one decorative. What about this one? Yeah, that one's pretty easily identifiable as a slab serif. It has serifs. There's little thick to thin transition. The letters are very box-like. They're pretty much going straight up and down. There's no stress. So that would be a slab serif. What about this one? Yeah, definitely decorative. I mean, there's even a texture in the letters. The letters are kind of wonky. They're starting at stopping at different points. Some of them have a stress. Some of them don't. Some of them have a serif, some of them don't. So if you look like the N's have serifs, the F has a serif, but then the T's don't. So again, the A doesn't, not a consistent font, so that's probably going to put it in the decorative category. What about this one here? This one's a little bit tougher. Yeah, this is kind of, you might even say there's an argument to be made here. Maybe it's even modern. So you're noticing, hopefully, there's a trend here. Old style, slab, and modern, there's a lot of overlap between those three because they were kind of all developed at the same time, those font family characteristics. But it has old style characteristics, because there is some thick to thin transition, okay, some. Your serifs are at a slant, but I would even say the thick to thin transition, it's pretty severe in some of them, so that might make it more modern. Your letters are going straight up and down, so this one I would say is kind of all over the place, but regardless, it's a pretty good body copy font, right? It's a pretty basic font. So now that you're done with this, you can start the next video lesson, which is the lecture video, which is going to be on the font relationships. I broke this up just because this gets a little bit long if you need to take a break or if you want to watch it at another time. The next step is, now that you know the 6 different font categories, how do you pair fonts together when you're using different fonts in the same piece of graphic design? I'll see you back in class.